if your goal is to have a business funnel where you're trying to build your business up and get more clients, then give value in that regard that's going to help you build your business. And never focus on the numbers, as oftentimes people get so wrapped around how many listeners I have. But if they would just take a second and visualize, let's say the number is 1,000. And if you just Google 1,000 people image and look at that image and maybe even print that out and put it on the wall where you can see it, and you can visualize 1,000 people versus thinking about it as a number, you'll have a different approach when you're coming in to create the content. I always tell the content creators, respect your audience and make sure that you're giving them the attention and the focus and value that you would if you were face to face with them. Because it's actually, if you think about this medium, it's more intimate.
Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. Today on the podcast, I have Todd. He is the founder and CEO of Blubrry Podcasting. It is a podcast host. Now, you guys know that I tend to talk about Buzzsprout. That is my podcast host of choice, but I think it's so important to have other people on, other hosts, other options for you guys, because I do believe that it is not a one-size-fits-all. Todd doesn't spend a lot of time talking specifically about the platform. So if you're like, don't want to listen because of that, believe me, you are going to get so much value from this episode. We talk about the history of podcasting. We talk about where it is now and where we believe it is going. He gives some really great advice about ways to grow your show today. So you're going to want to listen to this episode. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Todd to the podcast. Hello, Todd. Thank you so much for being on the show. I'm really excited about this conversation. I think it's going to be so good. So if you could just start by telling everyone who you are and what you do and about your platform.
Sure, Alicia. Thanks for having me on. And I guess first off, my name's Todd Cochrane. I'm an 18-year podcaster as of last Sunday, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. But I am a full-time podcaster. I do 3 shows. I do a tech show that was the one I started with called Geek News Central. I do a show called New Media Show, which I actually do with a competitor. We've been doing that show for more than 10 years. And then I do a company podcast called Podcast Insider. But probably more importantly is my role as the founder of Blubrry Podcasting. We're a full-service podcast host. We provide just about every possible service a podcaster would need. But probably our big difference in the way we operate compared to some of our competitors' space is essentially we help podcasters build their shows on their brands. And I have a saying I've said for many years: you never build a castle on rented property. And that's kind of a little bit of our philosophy. But we can get into that. But yeah, thanks for having me on your show.
Yes, very excited. And I 100% agree with that philosophy. I think that it's so important to, especially as business owners, right? Make sure that you own what you're saying. So I was recently listening to an episode where someone was talking about PR and making sure that you're showing up as a credible source. And the host had asked, well, what if I post articles on LinkedIn? And the PR person was like, no, that's not really a good idea. Put it on your own website, a place where you own, a domain that you own, where it's not up to the whim of someone else to say, I don't like this, and I'm going to take it down. So definitely a great thing to notice. So how does Blubrry do that?
Well, we started off in the very, very beginning of being more of an advertising rep firm. And then over the years, the company's evolved. But we have a plugin called PowerPress for WordPress that about 85,000 podcasters use to basically make their podcast their own. They control their feed and really the full process for their website, which allows them to have that good Google SEO at the episode level. Any show can be found by its title, in 10 different places. But where you win today is really at that episode level and having a good SEO strategy. But our plugin PowerPress, again, is probably the mainstay that keeps a lot of our customers doing what they do and then integrating with us directly. We have, some customers that have their shows on the Blubrry platform, largely because maybe they're on a CMS or some other type of publishing system that doesn't support WordPress, Wix, or Squarespace or something like that. So not all of our clients have a .com, but high majority of them do. And of course, we provide every content creator that hosts with us a free WordPress site. But again, that's all semantics. That's some of the podcast 101 stuff that most podcasters today do.
So I am curious because when I first was looking at what podcast host should I pick? Where do I want to go? I do have my website on WordPress. And so Blubrry was one of the ones that I was looking at. And I was like, well, how much am I going to have to do on the tech side? Because I know WordPress can be a little confusing for people on that tech side. It has gotten a lot better over the years. But if you're looking back at 2016, 2017, it was oh, I don't know much about coding. I might need to do that for this. And I actually did not know that you guys were also available as a plugin on Squarespace and Wix and other ones like that. So what integrations do you have with each of the platforms? Because obviously I didn't know it all.
I think the most important thing is talking about that challenge, that's why we do manage WordPress for the hosting customers, because some people do not have the technical skills. They just want to click, 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 click and be done. And we fully understand that. So we make that as an option for them to be able to do that. But, I think one thing to remember is podcast hosting providers today is kind of a commodity. 5 years ago, I had 5 competitors. Now there's 25. And what we really do is in the being able to provide to the customer these growth tools, publish, analyze, grow. We provide them the information that they need to help push the show forward. But if someone's on Squarespace or on Wix, or maybe they're on an old content management system, they can simply publish on the platform and just like on YouTube, take that player embed, copy it over to their website, and or we provide a feed for them just like the other hosting providers do typically. So that is an option. So we've got really the kind of getting out of the gate, getting started. And oftentimes what we see is shows will kind of graduate over time because initially when someone's creating a show, it's hard enough creating the content and not want to have to worry about everything else. So oftentimes we find that if a content creator can get to episode 1, 2, 3, then after they kind of get a few of those under their belt, they have that moment to breathe. And they say, okay, what else should I do? And then they can baby steps start adding stuff. But as far as integrations go, we integrate with other folks too. We integrate with Descript, with Hindenburg, with Rev. There's a variety of platforms that we integrate with. So some folks are using those tools. They can either shove their media over or, there's a whole host of functions there. And we're adding a lot of that currently. But, if we look back from, when I started podcasting, you had to be a pretty big nerd and that's why the tech show, I was a techie in the very beginning. But I think now we're at a point where everyone can create a podcast. And for me, that's the most exciting thing. We've got women that are leading the pack in creating more new shows than men right now. Women of color are just coming on strong with strong voices and strong stories. This space is moving internationally now. And everyone has a different goal. And it may be a goal to have a funnel. It might be a goal to just chit chat with a girlfriend, or maybe the goal is to build a big audience and make money. So I think what I really kind of focus on in the things I do on a day-to-day basis and talking to content creators is really, what is your goal for your show? Because all you hear about on all social media, oh, got to make money. Well, that's not always it. That's not always the goal of the content creator.
We've had a few people on who've shared very similar thoughts on making sure that you're clear on these goals, because it's so easy to get distracted. Like you said, there are so many podcasts now, and it's okay, I want to make money, I want to get out there, and I want podcasts to be unique, and I want it to be something that nobody has ever said before. but most likely someone is already saying it, maybe in a different way or a little bit of a spin. And the majority of the podcasters are not making money from their show at all. And I don't think that people really understand that. And it really does boil down to, what are your goals? Is your goal to create a place where people can find you and learn about you? Then SEO is going to be really important in that. Even more than like having a big guest. Like that part doesn't even matter at that point. It's about having an SEO strategy, having the right content that you're putting out there. And if your goal is to make a big name for yourself, then there's a lot of things that go into that. It's not just, oh, I showed up every week and everybody's going to listen. Like everybody has this idea of, I want to be Joe Rogan and I want to make millions of dollars. Like, you don't want to be Joe Rogan. First of all, like, be you, please. And also, he was a household name with Fear Factor in the 90s. Like, there's a lot of things that have led to him making millions of dollars. It was not just an overnight success. So what do you usually tell people who are feeling kind of like that?
Well, I look at my own self. I started as a blogger, and I was not a good one. And I was really trying to build authority in the space. So the podcast was a means to continue to build authority in the tech space. So I tell content creators, when I talk to them, again, if your goal is to have a business funnel where you're trying to build your business up and get more clients, then give value in that regard that's going to help you build your business. And never focus on the numbers, as oftentimes people get so wrapped around how many listeners I have. But if they would just take a second and visualize, let's say the number is 1,000. And if you just Google 1,000 people image and look at that image and maybe even print that out and put it on the wall where you can see it, and you can visualize 1,000 people versus thinking about it as a number, you'll have a different approach when you're coming in to create the content. Because if you're going to walk out on a stage in front of 1,000 people, I guarantee you're going to be more prepared to talk to those 1,000 face to face than you are when you sit down and pull up the mic to talk to that same number of people. So I always tell the content creators, respect your audience and make sure that you're giving them the attention and the focus and value that you would if you were face to face with them. Because it's actually, if you think about this medium, it's more intimate. We are literally, the folks that are listening to your show right now, we're in their head. We're literally, because most of them are plugged in with earbuds. Sure, someone might be listening on a speaker, but I don't know about you, but I listen to podcasts. I can't work. I lean in and stop. Sometimes I'm on the keyboard and I put a million Z's on the screen because I've held the keyboard down, right? Because I'm transfixed. Now, I can't say the same about radio, maybe a little bit with some YouTube channels, but with podcasting, really you have to listen to what's being said, unless it's a music show or something like that, you can enjoy it. But I think really the advice I give to content creators is when you're creating content, value that audience, treat them like family, think that they're sitting at the table with you. And I think if you learn how to have that intimacy, then you're going to grow. Don't talk at them. Essentially, oftentimes what we'll do is we'll make general statements like, what do you all think? And it shouldn't be what all you think. It should be, what do you think? I'd love to hear your feedback because we're having a one-on-one, you and I. But if we ask this audience to give feedback, we shouldn't address them as all. We should address them as individuals. Because that's how people are consuming this content as individuals.
Yeah, I love that idea of printing out a picture. I recently sat down with a client and was like, she was feeling down about her numbers. And I was like, well, let's look at your followers and look at the top 3 platforms. You have 350 people who have clicked the follow button and said, I want to be notified when you have a new episode. Imagine 350 people in a room. They are there for you to speak. That is so exciting. And it makes you kind of sit up a little straighter and actually be like, okay, wow, these people are waiting on me because it's more than just the people who might listen on an off chance. Like, these people want to show up. They want you to show up every week for them. And yes, it is such an intimate medium.
And again, when it comes back to podcasters talking to me about money, it's often like, okay, so let's have a frank conversation. If you're a neurosurgeon and you have 1,000 people listening to your show that are neurosurgeons, your podcast is going to be incredibly valued based upon who's listening to the show. You'll be able to demand an incredible advertising rate that would probably make you very wealthy very quickly. Versus if you're doing, like I did, a tech show, a news show, just talking about general topics in the tech space, I had to build a big audience in order to see a good return on advertising dollars. So the more narrow you are, oftentimes those audiences are more valuable than if it's a little wider. But I also tell people, don't go subject shopping. That's the worst thing you could do, because if you're not passionate about what you're talking about, listeners will smell that. They'll smell that in a minute, and you will not grow at all. So I always, follow your passion, the thing that you can talk about on a dime without even thinking about it. That's what you do your podcast about.
You put your heart and your soul into your show. And I want to help you reach all of those potential listeners out there. That's why I'm excited to announce my upcoming podcast marketing workshop. It's about giving you practical tools to grow your audience. You'll learn the secrets to getting your podcast discovered, attracting your dream listeners, and boosting those download numbers. This workshop will be hosted live with a replay available on April 30th. You can sign up by going to galatimedia.com/workshop. Let's grow our podcasts together. Yes. Ugh, it's so important. Like, if you're not passionate about it, to your point, your audience, they can hear it. They can hear it in your tone. They can hear it in your voice. At that point, you're just monologuing. These are the latest stats. Here's the information. All right, reach out to me because I want to talk to you. They're not going to want to talk to you. They're not interested in that. And I think that's where, like, a lot of these celebrity podcasters, I'm not saying that right. Not celebrity podcasters. Podcasters who are celebrities in the podcast world because their voices are so prevalent. I remember I went to a podcast conference a couple of years back, and I was talking to someone, and she had started the very first Peloton podcast. And she would go to Peloton conferences, and people would be able to know her just by her voice, which I think is so fascinating. Like, oh my goodness, are you so-and-so? And then they would fangirl over her, and she's like, oh, okay, hi.
And when that happens to you the first time, that's wonderful. I've been grabbed at airports, like ordering at McDonald's one time. So someone grabbed me and said, "Are you Todd?" And that was before I was doing video. And I'm like, yeah. Oh, I'm a fan of your show. And they know you. So it's this weird, it's a celebrity dynamic because they know you. You don't know them. But in essence, you do, because you know who your listeners of your show are. So instantly you have a friend and someone that has a common like or interest. So it makes it really, really simple. So that's the fun thing that happens when you've been podcasting a while, is getting that interaction, or, have a meetup and 30 people show up in a town that you've never been in. Those are exciting things you can do. It's part of the podcast growth strategy over time. But I think oftentimes, I tell content creators that if you start, you have a 50% chance of making it to episode 7. And people look at me often and I say that the majority of people that start, 50% don't make it to episode 7 because they figure out it's hard work. And then another barrier point seems to be about 20. And if you make it to episode 20, then you've got a really, really good shot of making it 2 years. But I think the approach oftentimes podcasters consider is wrong. I think they don't need to think about next week. They need to think about the next 2 years. What are we going to do over the next 2 years to build a show and build an audience? I'm not Oprah. I'm not a celebrity. So for me, when I started my show, I really had 2 goals: build authority and then sometime monetize, because in the early days, it wasn't $12 a month to start a podcast or free. It was hundreds of dollars a month because there was no hosting providers available. So I was just trying to cover expenses in the early days. Thank God it's, the barrier to entry right now is almost nothing. So I think that it's a good time, and believe it or not, even though there's reported 4 million podcasts, well, in reality, only about 130,000 of them have created a new show in the last 10 days, 400,000 in the last 30. You divide that by 30 some Apple categories. And what does that really mean? You're probably competing with 8, 9, 10,000 shows, maybe less. It still seems like a big number, but if you compare that to YouTube, and so this medium is right to grow in. Granted, you got to do the grind, you got to put the time in, but I think anyone that really focuses and has superior content, they're going to find success. You just got to put your time in, just like anything else.
Yeah. I love that at the beginning you mentioned that you had tried blogging and you were terrible at it. That you found podcasting. I also find that the idea of sitting down and writing a blog, I could do it, but man, it just takes me forever. Whereas I can write an outline, sit down, and all right, let's go. Let's have this conversation. And I feel like podcasting has given people a way to use their voice in a way that they haven't been able to before. And you mentioned a few steps before, but what did podcasting look like at the beginning? And how has it kind of shifted as it's moved into this? What is it now?
Well, even though as a failed blogger, I still blogged. And I did it to feed the Google beast. Because Google was my friend. That was my in route to gaining new listeners to the show. So really the early days, remember, there was no iPhone. There was the iPod. There was no Facebook. There was no Twitter. There was no LinkedIn. None of this existed. So all you really had was places where people were hanging out in groups and different services. So you really had to go where your audience was. You truly had to find the audience. And then you had to learn how not to be a snob and say, hey, I got a podcast. Come listen to my podcast. No, you had to interject yourself if someone was talking about a topic that maybe you had covered in your show. Said, hey, by the way, on my episode 22 or 46 or whatever it was at the time, I said, I talked about this topic about this part of the show. And if you want to check it out, go listen to it. So I allowed myself to be a contributor, not a promoter. And I think that's important today when you're hanging out in places where your audience is. And then I went to an event called the Consumer Electronics Show. Today, it's just called CES. And I went there to, number one, talk with vendors, find cool stuff, get new interviews, create additional contact, and make my circle of influence bigger. Because once we started putting them up later in audio and video, I made friends. I interviewed a small company called GoPro that had a little 20 by 20 booth. It was our first year at the event. And I was one of 3 to 5 journalists. And I went in as a blogger because they didn't have a podcast category at the time, and interviewed this brand new CEO of GoPro, and what he had was cool. So for 10 years, coming back as they grew into a 100 by 100 booth, and I would go right up to VIP because they said, they remembered those early days. So sometimes it boils down to often in your audience, who might be listening or who you might interact with. The example that I give is you never, ever, ever know who's listening because you know who some are, but all it takes is one person to make a big difference. I was talking about a product that Apple had introduced called the Mac Mini. It's a brand new product. It was a piece of junk in the early days. I was dogging on it and said, if I had 15 minutes to talk to Steve Jobs, I would tell him really what I thought about this Mac Mini, right? A week and a half later, his secretary called me and said, I got Steve on the phone for you. And I talked to Steve Jobs for 15 minutes about this piece of junk Mac Mini. Would end up him sending me then a Mac Pro as part of that conversation. And so you never know who's listening. So I tell podcasters, when you are doing your show and you're doing it on a content topic, think about your dream guest. And if your dream guest might be listening, how would you produce that show? How would you produce that episode if your dream guest was going to be with you? Or the best contact you potentially could get, someone that's in your avatar of this is who my best customer could be. If you really approach it that way, I think your way you go after doing your show is much, much different. I think it's much different in the approach you have in creating content. So I tell podcasters that all the time. And I don't necessarily relay the Steve Jobs story, but I say, you never know who's listening. So consider that when you're creating your content. But again, those early days were really about building community. Now today, what we got all this great stuff, Facebook. And so you need to really find out where your tribe hangs out. If they hang out on LinkedIn, hang out on LinkedIn. If they're on Facebook, hang out in the groups on Facebook. But again, don't be that, hey, I got a podcast. Be that person that's a resource. And then ultimately they're going to say, hey, what do you do? Well, I work in this industry and I have a podcast. You want to check it out? Yeah, here's the link. Wait for them to ask. And that way you're going to, again, it's a process though, but you just can't create the content. They say that saying, if you build it, they'll come. Well, not necessarily. No, you got to put the time in. You do. And I think there's probably 20 things we could talk on that topic alone. But I think it's more important about learning how to be intimate with your audience.
Yeah. And I think that's such a great starting point too for people. So yes, we could definitely talk about 20 different ones. Maybe we need to have you back on in a couple months and talk through those. But I think that is a great place to start, especially if you're a new podcaster, because having conversations with people and showing that you're a real human and showing that you're knowledgeable about a topic is going to help you. And I was just seeing, was it an Instagram post? And I think I saw it yesterday where the person was like, all these people are creating these short forms of content. And yes, they're so important. But short form content isn't going to win out against long form content like a podcast or like a blog. It's important, yes, in this is like a shift that's been happening, right? It's like TikTok and the quick reels and like all of these, shorts on YouTube and things like that. But podcasting isn't going anywhere. Long form podcasting isn't going anywhere. And when I say long form, I mean like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, some people up to 2 hours, which I think is bananas to me. But, that kind of content, the SEO strategy is still so important. And that's my take on where we're kind of going in the podcasting space. But where do you see it going? And what have you seen? And how is it now? And where you kind of think it's headed?
Yeah, I like the TikTok dopamine hit just like everyone else. But ask me the last thing I watched on TikTok or a YouTube short that made an influence on me. And I really can't answer that. Maybe it was an instant thing that I saw, oh, that's cool. But I can tell you which podcasts I listened to last that would make me sit back and think. And from where the space is going is real simple. Great content that doesn't waste listeners' time is the key, because we only have a limited amount of time in order to do things every day. Those 2-hour, 3-hour podcasts, I listen to some of them because they keep me engaged. As soon as they waste my time, I start fast forwarding through a segment because I know they're going to get some other stuff that's good. So again, figure out where you're wasting your listeners' time and get rid of that stuff. Just get rid of it. And you may want to talk about it, but get rid of it. I think that's really key in creating podcasts. So podcasts, during COVID, we had this big spike because everyone had a lot of extra time. Now that life is back, the growth chart is basic back where it was, 3, 4, 5% a year is what we're seeing from a growth rate in shows. But the key is longevity. If you can continue to do your show long enough and stay in the game, you're going to grow a big audience. But you have to do that work. And I say work because growing a podcast is work. And if you treat it as a hobby, that's fine. That's cool. If that's the goal, that's cool. You put it out every couple of weeks, once a month. If it's a hobby, more power to you. And there's plenty of room for that. But if you want to grow, you got to be there every week in their ear because listeners build you into their lives. You're not there at your specific time, they're going to find someone else to listen to. And that's why I always tell podcasters first 2 years, no breaks. I go against the mold. People hate it when I tell them that. If you're doing season 1 ends on Friday, season 2 begins on Monday, especially if you're brand new. You got to put the work in. But I think the podcast space is just going to continue to grow. what we saw during the last downturn in the economy is people kept on creating content because it became a part of their business strategy and part of their social strategy. So podcasting is not something they're going to give up.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Is there anything else you'd like to share about Blubrry or about your own show as we kind of wrap this up?
Yeah, I think for those, there's always going to be someone out there thinking about the money. And the way we've approached the money situation is we feel that it's important, just like that email you get from a listener that says, man, I love the show, or even the email that comes and says, I hate the show. Those are good feedback one way or the other. But I think too, you're putting a lot of time into building this, and sometimes you're not seeing a lot of reward. So one of the things we've done, some other hosts have done this too, is we're putting kind of this interim solution in called programmatic advertising, where you can monetize from day one. It's not going to be a lot of money, but it's at least going to be a little bit to wet the beak and say, yes, there is potential here. And we hope that programmatic advertising for all podcasters, especially the brand new ones that are small, will be the bridge to succeeding with either big advertising deals, finding your voice, or even to the point where maybe you decide advertising is not the goal for you. Maybe the goal, again, is a funnel for your business. But I think a lot of podcasters get discouraged because they have nothing to show except for maybe a little feedback. So for us, and I think what we really want to do is just get some money into these shows a little bit. Maybe it covers your hosting bill. Maybe we'll pay for a little production time. Who knows? Whatever, kind of is that spot that kind of irritates you at the end of the month. And especially with the economy right now, people are tightening their budgets up. I think we're definitely wanting to see if we can help find that bridge for podcasters. Blubrry's, again, a full service company for big companies, small individuals. We serve everyone. I'm not really, again, I don't want to come across pitchy. Apologize if I have, but I think podcast hosting today is a commodity. So what we've really worked on is, again, providing data. As an example, we provide all of our content creators a media kit, provide the ability to do audience surveys, have the ability to see how far people are actively listening to their podcast when they click play versus follow or subscribe. Those types of data analytics to give someone intelligence and saying, wow, I'm losing audience at 50% of the way through the show. What am I doing wrong? And to make a change in the programming to get them the rest of the way through. And the best thing is you can try us for free if you want. You got to do is come over to blubrry.com without the E's, because we couldn't afford the E's. They were $2 million. So BLUBRRY.com.
Love that. We'll make sure to link that. And if someone wanted to reach out or say hi or connect with you, is there some place that we can send them as well?
Yeah, it's easy. Todd@blubrry.com is the place. Of course, I got a great support team with phone support. So if I always tell content creators, you get stuck, you can always call a friend. And that's, pretty valuable today. You reach somebody on the phone that, and all our support folks are here in the United States. So that kind of helps too. But, and they're all podcasters. That's another thing. So they know the challenge you've had or are having. So they've seen pretty much. So we're kind of a big family, and that's the way we look at our customers as well. But, enough of the pitch.
I mean, you guys have been tried and true. You've been around for years. So I think that it's still important for people to know, you guys are here in the beginning. I mean.
Yeah, 17 years for the company, 18 for me. So I have no more hair for those of you that can't see me, and a little bit grayer. So yeah, it's been a fun ride, but I wouldn't trade it for the world.
I love that. Thank you so much, Todd, for being honest and giving so much value in this conversation.
Well, I thank you for having me, Alicia, and much success to your show, and go podcasting. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.